Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello, and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of August 24th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again today by Josh Blank, Director of Research for the Texas Politics Project. And today we want to talk a little bit of Texas legislature. What do you think, Josh?
I love Texas legislature. I can't wait. I always have these cycles where when I'm in the legislature, I'm like, God, I can't wait for elections. And then once I'm in elections, I'm like, I can't wait for the legislature. And we're in that point of the year where I'm ready for the legislature.
All right. Well, what we'll do is we'll thread the needle with both. But let's go deep into hashtag TexLegLand.
No, I didn't say I could avoid any of these things.
And we'll start with talking a little bit about, we talk about public opinion in this podcast a lot. Today we're going to talk about, the opinions of a very narrow segment of the public. That is the opinion of House members in Texas. So a couple of weeks ago, a little less than a couple weeks ago, the chairman of the House Administration Committee, State Rep Charlie Geren from Fort Worth, released the results of a survey of House members' attitudes about the operation of the House and by extension, the Capitol in response to the pandemic. And that survey had been distributed initially by Quorum Report. They kind of made it public for their subscribers. But since then, it's been circulating. I think people had it. The questionnaire was made up of 38 questions, and it included 13 open-ended items. The document that was circulating was a pretty rough output from SurveyMonkey, and so we took a look at that. We're interested in it for a lot of the reasons you're talking about, Josh. Created graphics for most of the responses, including the open-ended responses, and to the extent that we had, probably the major value add that we could at least say we added was that we coded those open-ended responses when appropriate. And some of them were just general inquiries that made no sense to code. And so we then produced all those graphics, put them on our website, and you'll find that in our blog at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And if you just follow the link to the blog, you'll find it, and we'll put a little flag on there when we get done recording this. House members responded at least, 116 of the 150 House members responded at least partially to the questionnaire, although not all of those 116 responded to all 38 questions, just to clear the the underbrush there. And we don't have any information like crosstabs. We don't know what the party breakdown was. We don't know gender, any of this. So we wish we did, but we don't. We don't even really know how many chiefs of staff rather than legislators responded, though it was kind of fun in the open-endeds. It sure felt like there were a lot of legislators that did their own because, Charlie Geren got a lot of, well, Charlie, I think, in the open-ended responses.
So you're saying that a staffer wouldn't have responded that way?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect a lot of, hey, Charlie, from staff members.
Okay,
so
checking.
Yes, yeah, but it's good. So that's good social science. That is an assumption, but I think it's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
So, what does the survey tell us about thinking in the legislature, limited as the data are? Although, I'm saying that, and almost like being defensive, but this is actually a really unusually good glimpse into what's going on in the House. I think because this came from House leadership, and I know that they were pretty aware of this, obviously, in the Speaker's office. I think that's one of the reasons the response rate was pretty high, right?
Yeah, ultimately, you were saying this is more than just about how the Capitol, should operate. The question is, how should the Capitol operate in the session that's coming up in 2021? So this is actually very practical and really, very, meaningful for members in a lot of ways. And you're right. We don't know who didn't respond versus who did and whether there are, let's say certain, pockets of attitudes were missing because of the response rates. But the reality is this was what we'd call, put quote unquote, an elite survey, right? This is a very select group of people. And honestly, to have more than 2/3 of them respond to most of the questions, it may not be a perfect census, of what,
but it's pretty good.
But it's pretty good. I mean, ultimately, this gives you a sense of, I think this gives you a sense of the broad patterns, which is kind of what I think you get out of this.
Lesson, right? If you want to do this again, please have Charlie Geren send your poll out. So, and I think it's also like, as you kind of imply there, it also tells us something attitudinally, not just about the operation during the session or in the Capitol, and some things kind of respond to right away, but most of it is about session, but also the underlying attitudes, particularly at a time when there's a lot of discussion about what should be done in other institutional public spaces like, schools. And, and just to kind of get into it, I mean, one of the, at a basic level, there's a lot of evidence of just a general acceptance of basic social distancing containment protocols, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, you look across the board here to sort of see what people favor or oppose. And they were asked, again, as you said, there were about 30 some odd questions. A lot of them were closed-ended, which means there were, you could say, yes, I support this. No, I don't support this.
And I did like that. There were a lot of just yes, no's.
A lot of yes, no's. It's fun. But basically, we asked when they asked whether, for basically social distancing guidelines, whether members favor or oppose them, what you found was, pretty widespread approval of imposing the kinds of social distancing best practices that public health experts are suggesting. So 87% of the respondents favor temperature checks for entry to the Capitol, designating member and staff entrances separate from public entrances, requiring daily temperature checks, requiring face masks. You get down to about 79% who say limiting floor access to essential staff only. That starts to get a little bit more complicated. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But for the most part, we think about these sorts of things we expect of people, basically monitoring symptoms, keeping social distance, wearing masks. There's pretty much a broad embrace of that across the Capitol. Now, that might surprise some people because they might say, well, this is the most political of political institutions. But as you and I have been talking about a lot, this is based on an idea that not wearing a mask is like some sort of broad-based political statement, when the reality is, in all the polling that we've seen, both our own in Texas, others, others elsewhere, it's a small, it's a minority of Republican voters who are kind of holding out against some of these social distancing protocols. But the inverse of that is also true, which is that it's the vast majority of Republican voters who are saying yes to masks, yes to social distancing, and you see that reflected in the membership too. It's not, again, I think to the extent that these are surprising in terms of the embrace of social distancing, it's only against maybe a set of expectations that are, not really supported.
Right. The people that are standing outside buildings, with signs screaming about not wearing a mask are not very representative, not only of the population, but almost certainly our polling shows this even of Republicans. And I think, one of the things I really noticed here, 73% favored requiring testing, right? Which is, really gets right to the nub of it in a lot of ways. Now, there was a little less agreement on the criteria for opening the more fully, right, and what the timing of that should be. Although overall, people, a very small number of members, or a small share of members, were ready to just open it up. Only 5% said the criteria, the Capitol should be fully reopened when session starts.
Yeah, that's right.
Only 8% said that it should. I'm sorry. 11% said that it should be open, but at reduced capacity. Most people, that had a view of this wanted to wait for safety measures, even though everybody wasn't exactly on the same page in this open-ended item. This wasn't a yes or no question.
Right. This is something that we had to code. And so something important here is that, people could provide multiple sort of criteria for when basically the Capitol should be fully reopened. That's the point here. It's under what circumstances should the Capitol be fully reopened. So people could say, well, this and that and this or something. And so for those people, they're basically endorsing three things, right? And so the idea is, what are the things that people think are necessary? And you're right. What I think is interesting is sort of twofold. One is, the most common thing that members said was, well, when safety measures are implemented, which is basically saying to some extent, you tell me, right? I mean, if you've got good safety measures, open it up. And the assumption is that I think the assumption kind of underlying that is that that's going to happen. But going back to the previous discussion we just finished here, 15% it should be open right now. And ultimately that seems like a lot, but it's also consistent with, again, what we were saying, which is that, there's about, no matter what we ask, there's somewhere around between 8 and let's say 15 to 20%, depending on the question, who basically take the position that, basically take a position as if the virus is not a factor. Let's just put it that way.
Right.
That's, I think, the best way to put that, right?
Yeah, I mean, within there,
here.
Within them, there's a lot of, there are some gradations, but, I think it's fair to say, there's some degree of denial in all of the,
well, right, there is
in a lot of that position, right?
But I should point out that also, a quarter of the responses said, when a vaccine is available, right?
Yeah.
Which is obviously much less clear. So, even between those two responses kind of at the top that garnered the most, endorsement, either when safety measures are implemented, very vague, right? Or when a vaccine is available, very concrete and likely kind of distant. And so, even, on both sides, it's not like there's not a widespread agreement here, I would say, looking at this item about exactly, whether and how the Capitol should be reopened.
Right. And so, as we look at that, I think, what it also points us to is a really, kind of interesting universe of attitudes on access to the process, right? Because, there's this general, and we've been kind of moving through these attitudes about, well, how close is the membership to public opinion? How are people thinking practically about this? But when you start looking at the internal management, or you start looking at the access to the process, you go from attitudes not just about, it brings out attitudes not just about the virus and the pandemic and the response, but also to, how you're balancing that against the process and our expectations of transparency and access. And you see, I think more division on that, right?
Well, I'd go even further. I'd say
to some degree.
No, and I'd go even further. I'd say, you see this sort of, this friction between, safety and transparency and access. But I think what I wonder about, and you can only speculate on something like this, is also, the extent to which members are trying to, to some extent, handicap what the legislative session is going to look like, which is a pretty constant discussion right now. Is the legislature going to, be laser focused on, the budget and COVID and try to get out? Are they going to take on some of the other big issues? There's obviously redistricting. And so to some degree, there's almost already a bit of fatigue with the session before it's even begun, where some people are saying, well, geez, we really can't do much. And this dovetails with that, right? Because what you're talking about here ultimately is, what kind of access do members think, on the one hand are essentially, let's just say essential to the functioning of government? Does that include people being able to physically come and be able to give testimony
right.
to hearings on the one hand? So there's that aspect to it. On the other hand, there's this, I think public safety aspect, or, let's just say member safety aspect and public safety aspect, which is just, you got a bunch of, members coming to the Capitol from all over the state. You have a bunch of individuals and groups coming to the Capitol from all over the state, and bringing all those people into a closed, not super well ventilated space for long periods of time might not be super safe. But I also say there's a third aspect of this, which is, this kind of, which again, we can't know from this survey, but this overall idea of, well, what do you think the session is going to look like? And ultimately, is it going to be, I think there might be some sort of a question of, is it easier to get through what's going to be a very difficult session if we limit access? Now, again, nobody's saying that.
Yeah, that's, I don't know how to call that from this, but.
Well, I don't know how to call that from this either, but I think, to the extent that, there's a lot of uncertainty here. The idea between, who are you going to allow on the floor when talking about, press access? Are you going to allow people to mill about in the lobbies outside the legislature, whoever happens to do that?
Right. Let's look at some of what they say. So,
sure.
So basically when we say, when the survey asked, to one of your points, do you favor or oppose permitting visitor groups in the gallery if you limit their size and number. So, anybody that's been around a session, knows that there are huge, people have lobby days and Capitol Day, they're essentially lobby days during the session. And so you see these large groups of people all in, dressed in the same color T-shirt or shirt wandering on the Capitol, and then they get recognized in the gallery. While 63% favored letting people in the gallery if their size and number were limited. So they want to throttle this to some degree. But there was another more general question that asked whether members favor or oppose permitting visitor groups in the gallery at all during sessions. And 48% opposed it, 51% favored letting the groups in. That was one of the closest divisions in opinion in the survey, which I thought was interesting, so that's kind of like a public access, and, then there was also, a similar kind of, question, but you look at it from the staff and you also kind of like looked at this. Would you favor or oppose limiting floor access to essential staff during the session? 79% favored that. And, this gets us a little bit into kind of some of the inside baseball of, how people are thinking about this. And, we've talked about this a little bit offline that, the media don't really appear much in this survey at all.
No, not much.
But this is, the matter of limiting floor access is in part about that. Now, part of this is just straight public safety. We don't want to overinterpret the result. Part of this is just trying to keep the floor less crowded.
No, but I think highlighting the importance of this result is key, because I think, when we looked at an open-ended that asked, what practices and protocols do you believe are necessary in order to safely conduct the legislative session? And you look at some, basically the things that came up most frequently, it was the things you'd expect. 42% of people mentioned masks, 32% mentioned social distancing, 16% mentioned frequent testing, 16% mentioned like frequent sanitizing, including like the microphone cover on the back mic, right? Following expert guidance.
Yeah, well, I would think that would be pretty important. There's a lot of yelling and emoting that goes on back there.
Right. But right in the middle of all of those, in between social distancing and frequent testing, 18% said, limiting capacity or access to the Capitol. Now, I mean, ultimately, whether or not you have to wear a mask at the Capitol is kind of a yes or no either thing people can understand. When you start talking about this question of limiting capacity and limiting access, it really raises a whole host of other questions about, whose access? What's the capacity? What, are we talking about, basically the floor? Are we talking about committee hearings? Are we talking about the entire Capitol? And so ultimately it raises a lot more questions really than it answers. And the fact that it's so high on the list to me kind of indicates it's an interesting area to see, how they handle this.
Well, and at a macro level, that's clearly what's going on with the leadership. They're kind of feeling out, obviously, but they're feeling out where the points of conflict are going to be as they try to figure out what they're going to do. And particularly at a time when, as with everything else, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, who knows what this is going to look like come January when you have to adopt some rules.
Well, and I think you hit it on the head there, which is they're trying to game out points of conflict. Because I mean, one of the sort of interesting things about the survey was, even though there were a large number of open-endeds, they usually dealt with one topic maybe, but there were about 3 items that basically were meant to elicit from the members a sense of what the punishment process should be. Essentially, if we do adopt these rules and, a member or a staffer decides not to wear a mask on the floor or not to, socially distance or whatever. I mean, whatever it is. I mean, there were 3 open-ended questions that basically said, how do you want me to handle that?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, speaking of points of conflict, and what you can see
and there was not a majority support for a very punitive effect. I mean, there was a plurality support, but not majority.
No, I mean, basically, I would say the most common attitude was something to the effect of, well, however you deal with any other situation in which a member breaks a House rule, in which you'd kind of say, okay, sure.
Although there was, I was interested though. I mean, there was a lot of that, and I saw, but there's also, 43% did say restrict their access. That is to the floor, to hearings, to the building. So, This
But I would
is where
say-
I'd really like to see the tabs.
Well, this is also where, I mean, this is something where I think, it's one of the things about, taking open-endeds and just coding them. I think, that's true, right? I mean, I think the easiest, response, I think the easiest response cognitively and practically is to say, well, you restrict the floor access. But there were a number of people who either in that comment or another comment said, I don't know if you can do that.
Right.
I don't know if you can prohibit a member from participating in the process or if you want to. And I think that's ultimately that is the rub here, right?
Yeah.
Is the House going to go, so far in terms of the enforcement of its rules that it's going to take members out of the process who, when you put it this way, it sounds crazy, but endanger the safety of the body. Are they going to do that? Well, clearly that's an open question as of right now.
Right. And then there's also, there were a slew, or not a slew, but there was a little bunch of questions that also had implications for advocacy, think of it for various reasons. It's the lobby, but there's also, larger kind of public access issues here. But, about half said that they would limit visitors to their office, or go to a kind of an appointment only system. Yet only a third said they'd limit food in the office. So,
Well, come on.
you can't change the whole, you can't break the system here. Which, all of which was pretty interesting, but all of which I think is causing a certain amount of, a lot of discussion in the professional capital community about what access is going to look like. And frankly, how offices will use this to help, increase the filter who they have to talk to and who they don't have to talk to, and who goes into a situation like that with an advantage and who doesn't. And so I think, as you think about how advocacy works and what different people's skill sets and networks are and, how they go into this, if you're sort of one of, say, if you're on a big lobby team and your job is entertainment, that's not so good. Right. So as we're talking about you set this up nicely at the beginning by talking about how you were, interested in, sometimes pivoting, like when it's election time, we get, you said it, but I think both of us feel that way. You get kind of sick of elections. And then at a certain point in the legislative process, I would say probably about late March, maybe early April.
I was going to say early April. That was good.
God, I'd love to talk about something else. But let's talk about the intersection of the election and the legislature and the big story on that front. There's two big storylines going on here, one of which we won't have time to get on today, but I think we'll come back to pretty soon, which is the overall state of play and, the big parlor game in the professional world about the chances of there being major partisan change, most directly the House flipping from Republican to Democrat. But let's focus in on something that ultimately gets us to that.
Yeah.
The big election story in the last week or so has been Senate District 30, which is going to be vacated, but is not yet as a result of Senator Pat Fallon's selection to be on the Republican ticket to run for the seat that John Ratcliffe has vacated now that on his second try he will be Director of National Intelligence. And there have been a lot of people there's been a lot of speculation about this for quite a while. And so there's three big contenders right now, or three contenders we think, and we'll have a final read on this on Friday, which is the filing deadline. Most prominently in the Capitol community anyway, State Representative Drew Springer, who it's been an open secret that he's been sort of strategizing to run for the Senate seat since it became clear there was likely to be movement. Denton Mayor Chris Watts is kind of on the bubble. He said he's going to do it. He resigned as Denton Mayor, so it looks like he's going to do it, but I think that is yet to be confirmed, and I suspect there are a lot of people trying to talk him out of it.
Yeah,
and then most dramatically, the one and only Shelley Luther of Salon a la Mode fame, who is looking to transition into Senate a la mode, I guess.
It's a citizen legislature.
Yeah, yes. Well, yes, it is a citizen legislature. And this is, Shelley Luther, was the proprietress of the Salon a la Mode that was, in a highly visible and somewhat underwritten way, defied an early quarantine order and rose to, sort of prominence, at least in the state, and actually got some national coverage by, very publicly saying that it was a violation of her liberty for her to not be able to do business under a quarantine order.
Well, and ultimately she got sent to jail for it. I mean, because essentially the judge asked her to stop and or, apologize, and she refused. So she got sent to jail at that point.
Right.
And, that became, prominent mostly because of, Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick and other, prominent politicians taking up her cause as a
She gave Ted Cruz a haircut.
She gave Ted Cruz a haircut.
And not in the way that Beto O'Rourke almost did.
Okay.
He just gave him, Beto just gave him a trim.
Yeah, there you go.
And this is just, this is really rolled into a much bigger kind of issue. So, I think there's two things to look at here. First, just the race itself, shaping up, with Denton Mayor Chris Watts as maybe just kind of an X factor. Drew Springer is being billed as the insider, and I think with good reason. He was obviously kind of ready for this when Governor Abbott announced that the special election would be, or last week when he announced that the special election would be held September 29th. Drew Springer was obviously ready. His Twitter account then rolled out a bunch of, pre-produced graphics with endorsements from, a reasonably broad range of Texas legislators. Mm-hmm. And he was definitely ready to go. And then this week, he was endorsed by Texans for lawsuit reform, which is a sign of, Republican institutional support, if ever there was one. Mm-hmm. And Shelley Luther then, who has defied Greg Abbott kind of famously and in a an interview a couple of weeks ago with Jonathan Tylo, who's been a guest on the podcast multiple times, was pretty critical of Governor Abbott, I think it's fair to say, and has been a thorn in his side since all of this kind of unfolded. And so when Greg Abbott called the special session for the special election for September 29th, what that meant was that the filing deadline was, a week away, and early voting is going to start on September 14th. This is widely seen as very advantageous for Drew Springer and very indicative of people's on the inside, and certainly in the governor's office and in many corners of the legislature, shall we say, their lack of interest in seeing Shelley Luther join the upper body.
Oh, so strategery is what you're saying. It's funny. I mean, and you say, and you might, if you're listening, you say, well, why are we talking about this? But it's interesting. I mean, this is sort of, there's something about this little race and everything that's kind of an interesting little microcosm. I mean, I think the discussion that we've been having a lot, around sort of the pandemic is sort of the role of the executive branch, headed by Greg Abbott, and the role of the legislature, or really the legislature's absence in any of the state's sort of response to the pandemic. And so, we've been talking about this a lot, and we've been thinking about it a lot, and and the more I've been thinking about it, there is sort of a sense on the one hand of, there's a discussion to be had about whether the legislature does or does not want to be more involved, and that's sort of a separate discussion. But then the question of sort of, Abbott's, handling of it vis-a-vis the legislature is an interesting one, and in particular, the argument for Abbott maybe involving the legislature more in the process to some degree is, for what it's worth, is to expand the coalition and also distribute some of the responsibility for the state's response a little bit. But ultimately, I think this race actually highlights some of the difficulty of that. On the one hand, you just to set the Democrats for a second, the Democrats have been obviously very critical of the governor's response. But, in a lot of ways, Shelley Luther is an interesting representation not only of, where there is pushback among some of the Republican coalition against basically public safety measures to fight the pandemic that Abbott has really been forced to engage in a lot of ways, like requiring mask wearing and things like that, on the one hand, and sort of Republicans on the other who hang their hat on running good, efficient government is kind of is their sort of self-described calling card of the party. I would say, ultimately, the thing about this race that's interesting is that, Abbott, I wouldn't say Abbott created Shelley Luther, but he certainly gave her this opportunity to then be someone, who's basically part of the reason that Abbott doesn't want to involve the legislature in this. I mean, to be quite honest, is that there's a large, there's a large enough coterie.
One of many. There's one
of many, but there's a large enough coterie of Republicans in the House who would already make a special session difficult in terms of if the goal is to be more proactive on the virus. Not to mention the fact that, in the Senate, the lieutenant governor has essentially, it's not taking.
Yeah, I think there are two big problems. I mean, one, the huge problem is the Senate, and you're giving the lieutenant governor a forum if you were to call a special session. Again, special session is such an abstraction at this point.
Well,
there's also the problem of what happens with the speakership. Should you call a special session, and that's also an issue. But I think you're right in that it.
Well, and the special session is just an abstraction of a way that you might involve.
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah,
more.
I mean it's
right.
Like how many angels are dancing on the head of that pin in terms of the possibility of a special session getting called by this governor at this time. No. But I do think that, you're right to sort of point out. I mean, for people that follow this brewing kind of, model of the Republican Party is, riven by these factions and the kind of center, I don't know what you would call it, far right versus the distant right, kind of fighting over these things, has been kind of scrambled in the last few months of the pandemic, even though it's been brewing from the very beginning. And it's bringing to the surface some of the things that were there all along as the governor was trying to figure out how to balance the politics of the pandemic response. And we've talked a lot about that. I think it's going to be tempting for a lot of people to see this as a real bellwether heat check for that, given just how Republican that district is. I mean, the district, I think the last time, that Fallon ran in that district, he won with 75% of the vote. So It's kind of an interesting, it's tempting to see this as an interesting laboratory for Republican politics, although I think there's a lot of qualification for that I think we can kind of probably bring back as we put this in the context of the broader kind of struggle over the legislature that's coming up in 2020, and then how that plays out in 2021 and what those contingencies are. So I think with that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. If you can find this podcast at all times on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. You can find lots of supporting data for this. If you found this podcast in one of those places, go to our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You can look at the graphics for the data on the legislative survey, the House survey we talked about earlier, and all kinds of other data representations, blog posts, and other kind of goodies if you're interested in Texas politics and government, in particular, the Texas legislature. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.